Stanford University.
I'm going to now, with pleasure, introduce today's keynote speaker, and actually this kind of follows on a lot of what I've been saying about the synergies between the humanities and Silicon Valley, at least the potential synergies. So Geoffrey Moore is a Silicon Valley-based high-technology consultant, a venture partner at Moore Davidow Ventures, and an author who's written important books on business strategy. His work has dealt with the spread of innovations, how innovations break into the market, how they spread, and the chasms and tornadoes that surround high-tech innovation. His books include Crossing the Chasm, Dealing with Darwin, The Gorilla Game, Inside the Tornado, and most recently, Escape Velocity. My colleague Tom Byers from the engineering school, who was the faculty director of Stanford's Technology Ventures program, has described Crossing the Chasm as, quote, the Bible for entrepreneurial marketing 15 years later, close quote. So I read that when Crossing the Chasm was published, Moore and his publisher originally thought the book would sell about 5,000 copies. It would be pretty good for an academic book. By 2002, 10 years after its first publication, more than 300,000 copies had been sold. Moore, again, reading off the web, attributed this to word-of-mouth marketing, resonating initially with high-tech managers and then spreading to engineers, venture capitalists, and finally to business schools. But I wonder if at least one key to his success is not only the power of his ideas, but the power of his writing. Moore received a bachelor's degree in American literature from Stanford University and a doctorate in English literature from the University of Washington, and he began his professional life as an English professor. One of the quotes that I read about him says, quote, he is the master of creating a vocabulary, close quote, for management strategy. He's found the words. So, as you go through the day, think high tech, think English department, and welcome Geoffrey Moore.
Thank you. Thanks. So I've kind of two agendas for this talk, and I think we're going to talk for about 20 minutes and then have a little Q&A. One agenda is to sort of reinforce the notion of what is the role of the humanities in a technology economy. And the other one is, how does an individual with a doctorate in Renaissance literature get a job, right? And I take both of these very seriously. But let me start a little bit with the value here. So I think the value in general has been articulated, which is whether you call it the master of the words, analysis, synthesis, communication skills. There's a lot that you have as a humanities major that is fundamental to interacting with human beings in any venue, in any circumstances. And if you step back from it, I happen to look at it through the lens of literature and literary ideas. Narrative is fundamental to human existence. Humans can't live without narratives, nor can they solve problems without narratives, nor can they envision markets without narratives, nor can they inspire people to buy things without narratives. And if you've been spending a lot of your time studying narrative, you know a lot about narrative. You know a lot about narrative that other people do not know. And your ability to apply that knowledge is incredibly powerful. At another level, you can think of it as a level of analogy and metaphor in problem solving. Intractable problems get solved by metaphor. You don't solve them in the domain of the problem, because if you could solve them in the domain of the problem, they wouldn't be a problem, right? But as soon as the domain gets stuck, it gets unstuck from some pattern that you detect in another venue and then you bring across to the problem domain. And that act of analyzing metaphor and of understanding is fundamental to literary criticism. So you can't take an English class and not learn how to do that. And if you were an engineer and didn't like English class, you learned a lot of cool stuff, but you didn't learn how to do that. And it's a really, really important skill. So I don't think we have to sell, I don't think we should have to sell the value of the humanities from the point of view of once you're inside the system, once you're acculturated to the system, once you understand the issues in the system, can you apply the mental skills, whether they're verbal skills, analytical skills, communication skills, inspirational skills? I think the answer is yes. I think we got to focus on what's the real problem. The real problem is something, if you look at words, basically they fall into 4 chunks. Nouns, verbs, modifiers, and conjunctions. And there are 8 parts of speech, but pretty much there are 4 that matter. It turns out that nouns are the problem. When you invest, well, think about it. You've invested an enormous amount of your life, when you get a PhD, in a very, very specialized set of nouns. You're personally invested in them. You are incredibly articulate about the relationships between those nouns. Most people you meet don't even know those nouns, right? But for you, they are incredibly compelling. And it turns out that is not transferable, okay? In fact, Roger, would you put up our slide? Could you put up our slide? Yeah, this is a cartoon which says, and so you see, Mr. Snidely, the symbol of the fly in French literature does, in fact, have a lot to do with your product. That, unfortunately, is not true. The nouns don't transfer. But the good news in this is the verbs, the modifiers, and the conjunctions are all the same. That turns out to be phenomenally profound. Because the better you are with verbs and modifiers and conjunctions, the better you think. And again, people in this valley, we really celebrate the mathematical imagination. And by the way, there's a mathematical equivalent to what I just said for people who can think in matrices and integrations and derivatives and all the kinds of cool math stuff. This is an equivalent idea in language. But the verbs, the modifiers, and the conjunctions matter, and you can't write a dissertation that will get accepted if you're not really, really good with verbs, modifiers, and conjunctions. So that's what you're going to take over to whatever it is you do next, and it is going to make you very, very powerful. But you've got to get over what I call the noun hump, okay? And so I'll tell you my story about what happened to me, and then I'm going to kind of suggest how. But here's the first rule. You cannot study your way over the noun hump. Basically, you're going to have to learn 100 and then 500 and maybe as many as 1,000. Well, that's probably too high. The first 10 nouns will hurt your head, and the next 50 will break your skull, right? Because you're starting all over again. I started learning molecular biology about 6 or 7 years ago. So it was endoplasmic reticulum. Really? Golgi apparatus. No shit. I mean, it was like, so then there are hundreds of these words, hundreds of them, and your head starts to hurt. But if you can get over the noun hump, all of a sudden it's the same verbs, same modifiers, same conjunction. So it's a really exciting place to go, and you can actually play with the nouns in really interesting ways once you know what they mean, okay? So you can't study your way across the hump, in my view, or at least I think it's a very inefficient and probably at the margin won't work. You have to do immersion. This is just like learning a foreign language. You've got to immerse yourself in the vocabulary, which means you have to do the work. If in the case of tech, you have to join a tech company and start working immediately. And initially, it's going to break your skull. So the question is, how would you get a job? Why would anybody give you a job? So let me tell you a tiny story about how I got my first job. But I think it's a little bit of it's not quite at the center of my recommendation, but it's close enough for starters. So I'm 32 years old. I have a doctorate in English literature. I've been teaching for 4 years at Olivet College in Michigan. We have 3 children. Marie's Filipino. Rural Michigan is kind of redneck. We're thinking, you know what? We need to move back to California. Wow. Academic mobility, 1978? Not so much. Not so much. There were 400 people that applied for the job that I got in Olivet, Michigan. So I didn't really expect to get a job in academics coming back. But we said, okay, Marie's family lived in Palo Alto. We'll live with them. I have a Stanford graduate. They have a career placement thing. Somebody can find me some sort of a job. We'll go see. And I'd heard about Silicon Valley, okay? Well, maybe Silicon Valley would be good, okay? So what I did was, and this is an important principle, I had written a handbook for how to help other humanities professors teach English, because we couldn't afford to have a big enough English department to have all of freshman English taught by English professors. So I'd worked on that. And so when I came out here, And we started looking for a job. I went to the Career Center. I wrote a resume. I did all this stuff. But I also went and saw Nancy Packer, who was the freshman English director at the time. I said, Nancy, here's some work I'm doing. I'm really interested in it. What do you think? She said, wow, this is pretty cool. She said, why don't you, I'd love for you to give a chalk talk to my grad students about these ideas. So I said, great, I'd love to do that. So gave the chalk talk. The chalk talk went over pretty well. I'm thinking, well, maybe there's some little stringer thing I can do for Nancy, get a little coming in. And then Hewlett Packard called up Nancy and said, we want to do a writing workshop for our managers. Can you recommend somebody? And she recommended me. So now I go over there, and all of a sudden it's like, wow, okay, so how much could you charge for a workshop? And I'm thinking, gosh, could you charge $1,000? I don't know. So anyway, I sold 2 workshops for $3,000 a piece, just sweating bullets. And then I was still applying for jobs, and I got a job interview, first one. And I go to the city. It's a software company, a mainframe software services company. They're looking for an educational specialist. And I said, well, okay, so I know a lot about education. I don't know anything about software. But if I can apply the process, and I've done work with conceptual models and frameworks, maybe we can do something. Well, they hired me. And in retrospect, I'm thinking, why the hell did they hire me, right? And part of the deal was the guy who was looking, Don Parr's a hell of a good guy. He said, Jeff, all the other people I'd interviewed had basically what he was saying is they had all the nouns and they had very, very bad skills with verbs, modifiers, and adjectives. And he didn't put in that language, but that's what he was saying. You looked bright, you looked interesting, and the other people kind of frankly looked like they, those who can do, those who can't teach. They look like that kind of a moment of not very happy moment. So anyway, I got the job, and I went around and I interviewed everybody in the company, and I tried to figure out training needs, and I put together something, and it was pretty interesting, and we got going on it. And then I said to Don, Don, the only person who doesn't have a training program is me. He says, no, you have a training program. I said, well, Don, I'm the training director. I mean, no, I don't have a training program. He said, yeah, you do. I said, what do you mean? He said, we're using the pretend method of training. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, when you applied for this job, you pretended that you knew how to do it. And I pretended to believe you. And now you have to make it come true. But and I said, I'll never learn all the nouns. And I got to tell you, 3 years later, I get a job. Another company asked me to leave because they think I'm so expert in this thing, I must be like a computer engineer. So once you learn the nouns, you can actually, the difference between knowing and faking kind of disappears. It starts with faking and it ends up being knowing. And it's like, when did it change? I don't know. Okay. But here the point I want to close with is from the point of view of, so look, the value is there. You don't have to argue about the value. The value is, it's huge. The issue is penetrating the semi-permeable membrane called the first job, okay? I mean, because you don't look like anything that fits into any box that anybody has a rec for, right? So how does that work, and how does it work particularly in this valley? Well, the thing I want to carry over from what Don had to this valley is when organizations are growing, they can absorb talent that they can't absorb at other times. And they will take risks with talent when they're growing that they cannot take at other times. So the first deal is you must go into a place where the companies in that category are trying to hire a lot of people. Because otherwise, I don't think it works. Because basically, it's like a football team occasionally does what they call drafting the best available athlete. Sometimes football teams actually will draft a track star and try to turn him into a wide receiver. That's what you're going to be. You're going to be one of those drafts. You're a track star. They're going to try to see if they can make you into a wide receiver. So the first deal then is you have to go where there's enough appetite for talent. I mean, Google would be a good example. Not a lot of software companies have an in-house philosopher. Yeah, okay. That was one guy that got through, okay? But maybe that's not job position you'd see too many recs for. So what would you see recs for that you think, and it's all the customer-facing stuff. So customer support. If you're feeling a little bit shy and you don't feel like you're not an extrovert like me, you say, well, maybe customer support would be a good spot. Customer support, very quickly, yes, you have to learn the nouns, yes, you have to learn what it is, but they actually train you in that stuff, and after a while you get better and better at it. And so what would happen after a year in customer support is you'd be over the noun hump. you would know the nouns in your company and probably in your category and in a bunch of categories close to it. Another one is online sales. Now, what's happened to sales is interesting because in this decade, more and more sales is done in an interactive way over the web. So it's some email, it's some Twitter, it's some chat, it's some on the phone, and it's some visiting. And selling in tech is not like selling in used car lots, right? This isn't like, hi. I mean, you got to think when you sell this stuff, right? You have to listen. You have to do problem solving in real time. So if you've ever taught anybody, the teaching skills and the selling skills in tech are very similar to each other. Going forward. So, and that seems like the anathema to somebody in the liberal arts. Oh my God, I can't be in sales. There was a time, by the way, that's another thing you got to watch out for, your sense of being entitled or elite. You're somehow, your sensibilities are too refined to engage in commerce. I mean, if you were Jane Austen's period, that might work. Not so much now. But what you'd find out, by the way, is when you let go of that stuff and you just jump in with both feet, it's fun. It's fun because it's hard. It's fun because you're not good at it yet, but you think maybe you could get good at it. It's fun because you can make a difference, and it's most fun because you can get paid, okay, which is really fun, okay? Field marketing is another one, by the way. Just helping people. These technical things are very hard to communicate and explain, and you're an explainer. Right? If you can explain endoplasmic reticulum, or the Pleistocene era, or whatever it is, you can explain this stuff too. And part of it actually, because you bring beginner's mind to the thing, the D school here talks a lot about beginner's mind. Because you bring beginner's mind, you can probably explain it in some ways a lot better. So I just want to close with a couple of tactics. Sometimes there are no job openings. Right? They don't, or if they have job openings and they're just completely, they're nothing that would fit for you. They're looking for engineers. You're not an engineer. What you can do and what you should do is work your personal network or your parents or cousins or uncles or aunts or whomever to get referrals to say, I want to have an informational interview with an executive in any of the firms that you're interested in. So pick 10 firms you think would be really cool. And an informational interview, the social contract is someone will call that person and say, as a favor to me, I'd like you to talk to so-and-so. And what they want to know is, what is it like to work in your industry? What is it like to work in your company? And what kind of entry-level jobs are the ones that would have, make the most sense for somebody with a liberal arts background? I had two, this is how I got both of my daughters employed, God bless this system, because it worked. But in both cases, what happens is you go with the informational interviews and you have these conversations, and you're looking for a moment when there's chemistry. And the chemistry you're particularly interested in is the mentor gene in a manager. Because sooner or later, someone will look at you and go, God, this is what happened to Don Parr. I'd love to mold that person. That's somebody I'd love to put, I'd like to really see, get that person to start and see if I, give them a shot at this thing, because they look interesting to me. There's some part in me that resonates with where they are and what they are. And then whatever they ask you to do, you have to do, okay? And presumably this will get paid, but if they offer you a job, you say yes. And you don't negotiate. You'll negotiate for your second job, not for your first job. You just say yes, because you need to get into the system and you need to get over the noun hump. And until you're over the noun hump, you're actually a net loss to the company. You're not only you're not valuable, you actually subtract value because other people have to continually explain nouns to you as you're walking around. But as soon as you get over the noun hump, you become valuable. So understand that they're making a sacrifice too, and so you want to figure out any way. And in fact, in a really desperate situation, I would rather work doing anything and not get paid than not work. Because your problem is time to the noun hump tipping point. Just reframe your problem in that way, and that's where we're going. And then just do whatever it takes. And it's got to be a set of nouns that you can stay interested in. I mean, you got to kind of care. I mean, you're wired that way. So those are just some of the thoughts. I just wanted to kind of share that. I think let me just close by saying I'm in venture capital. So venture capital, what you do is you listen to presentations and pitches, as we're going to do today. And you hear 2 or 3 or 4 on a Monday, on a big day, maybe 1 or 2 on a slower day. Every one of those pitches is a story, right? It's just a story. It's in PowerPoint, for God's sake, right? The least credible PowerPoint slide in that presentation is the spreadsheet with the financials on it. because they're making it up, right? They're just making it up. I mean, who would know? But the rest of the story can be tested by literary critical values. Is it coherent? Is it compelling? Are the characters matching the plot? You know, et cetera. So narrative is really at the heart of all this stuff, particularly in the marketing and selling motions, as we were just talking about. So I would really encourage you to be a lot more optimistic, maybe, than you might otherwise be. So with that, I want to close. Thank you very much. Thanks.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.